40 years ago today, former Beatle John Lennon was shot and killed. His tragic death made headlines around the world.
Good evening. The death of a man who sang and played the guitar overshadows the news from Poland, Iran, and Washington tonight. Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed last night outside his luxury apartment in New York.
It was a devastating loss for his family, his former bandmates, and music fans around the world. They gathered on those cold December days after his death in 1980 to remember Lennon, and fans have continued to mourn every year since. So Joe Levy is the editor for Billboard and the host of the podcast Inside the Studio, and he's here now to talk about Lennon's impact on the music industry. It's been 40 years, and it really wasn't until I saw sort of that old newsreel that I thought, you know, sometimes you lose sense of what 40 years means until you see something like that and you realize how long ago it was and how different life is now. I want to play a clip of a vigil that was held not long after Lennon was shot.
Imagine all the people living on the day. They say I'm a dreamer.
So everyone there knows all the words to that song, and it occurred to me that probably everyone there sort of grew up with the Beatles to some degree, whether they became fans when they were just sort of the short-haired rebels flying across the pond to America, or when they were long-haired hippies, if you will. They had so many chapters, and at each phase they were impactful. What do you think it was about the Beatles that helped to change the music industry?
Sure, and we might be here a while because there's that much transformation to talk about. The Beatles invent a kind of thing. They are global stars. They are superstars unlike the world has ever seen, not just in America, not just in England, but all across the globe. And this music is a starting point. The Mop Tops, I Want to Hold Your Hand, these bright, happy, youthful songs, as you said. But what they do from there is continue to evolve and continue to evolve the music. And they bring us from rock and roll to rock to pop art. They begin to integrate social and political messages into their music. They try all sorts of experiments. And they go from making these titanic, earth-shaking singles to titanic, earth-shaking albums. And then they shock us all by breaking up as the 60s end and continuing with these solo careers. And they are writing the book as they go, right? They are inventing not just music, but culture as they go.
Yeah, it's so true. And so 40 years later, after he is shot and killed, fans are continuing to go to Central Park to pay their respects at the John Lennon Memorial. It's called Strawberry Fields, including people that, weren't even alive when he was shot. I want to play some sound of fans.
Came here at night with a big crowd of people and sang songs and cried. Very sad day I'll never forget.
Just a legend, taken too soon. And it's just really amazing that we have this place to keep remembering him by. So
John Lennon is going to mean and going to be a different person depending, I think, on, your particular vintage. There are an awful lot of fans who only know him post-death, right? Only know him as this icon who was killed, and because of that, they probably only know him as his sort of activist incarnation, or sort of the long-haired, not even long-haired. By then he had cut his hair, so it's sort of post-hippie kind of guy. Who is John Lennon to the various generations, particularly the kids who were born after he died?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, and it just depends not only on how old you are, but where do you want to locate yourself in the Beatles story and John Lennon's story. One of the amazing things about the Beatles is that they do renew generation after generation. So 10 or 15 years ago, a number ones collection came out, introduced a whole new generation of kids, little tiny kids, to these songs that shook the world of not just their parents, but their grandparents at that point. And so, are you a Beatles fan? Do you follow that forward into John Lennon's solo career? As you say, he entered the 70s, a long-haired political activist. He and Yoko had these novel events called bed-ins for peace. They just brought the media into their hotel room and held a press conference while they were in bed in a hotel room because they were manipulating their fame. They were manipulating celebrity. That was our equivalent of social media in 1970 or 71, I suppose. And so, you know, do you know that John Lennon? Do you know the Beatles' John Lennon? Do you know the John Lennon that we lost when he was just, and this is shocking, just 40 years old, 2 months after his 40th birthday, killed outside his apartment building, Upper West Side of Manhattan, having just released what would be his final album. And that John Lennon was a John Lennon who'd been away for 5 years, had spent 5 years away from fame, raising his second son, Sean, concentrating on his marriage, and had a different message, a message of being a happily married man, and being a house husband. And so this last chapter that he did not get a chance to finish sharing with us was one in which he was changing yet again and challenging us yet again to change our view of the world, to change our view of what it means to be a husband and father.
I think that's so fascinating what you just said, because we're sort of living in this era where we're kind of taking a second look at our heroes, right? With all the hashtags attached to them, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, like all the hashtags, and kind of like rejudging them based on the decisions that and words that they have said. And the thing about John Lennon, he wrote a lot of songs, and his preference was to write in the first person. So you get a sense that the man is revealing himself to you in his songs. Sometimes the things that he said in his music may not be politically correct, but people seem to still embrace him. And it seems like he's avoided kind of the finger wagging and judgment that of kind of the modern day sensibilities have placed on other past heroes. Do you think it's because he was able to be so honest about who he was, both the things that were great about him, but also the things that he personally thought was terrible about him?
Yes, I think you've made a really good point there. If he's avoided condemnation, it's because he fell on his face in public, quite literally. The period before he withdrew from fame is sometimes referred to as the lost weekend, except it lasted about a year. He left New York, he left his marriage, he went to Los Angeles, and he fell in with a hard partying crew and misbehaved in public. And misbehaved in public before the days of cell phone videos, but a lot of this was reported in the newspaper. It was caught on film by photographers who found him stumbling out of Los Angeles nightclubs, and it was an ugly situation. So he showed us, how can I put this politely, how bad he could be. He showed us his faults. And if he did not confess them directly in his songs, he acted them out in public, and then he withdrew and decided to change himself and change his life and rededicate himself to his marriage and completely change what he wanted out of life. He spent, it's supposed to be 5 years, baking bread, just raising his son, living a quiet life. And this is one of the most famous men alive, right? The Beatles had a kind of fame that no one had ever had before. And a remarkable, remarkable thing to just walk away from it and then to return, and to return with this album that initially when it was released, reviewers scratched their head and said, well, I'm happy that he's so happy in his marriage, but I'm not so interested. Because they didn't know what to make of this rock star suddenly saying, you know what, I love my wife, I love my son, I want to talk to you about that. Sometimes I get angry, sometimes I get jealous, sometimes things go wrong, but really, I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go by. I'm in love with life and in love with raising this child. And I have a message for you. Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. An enormously interesting and significant thing that he said in this song about his son Sean, a song called Beautiful Boy. And it's become something of a final word, a final thought in this album, again, released just weeks before he was assassinated.
Yeah. The magic of the mundane, right, in song. And
Right.
so often we don't want our icons to ever evolve. We don't allow them to. And so to see him do it so successfully, I think is sort of a great thing. So we're talking about, us knowing Lennon from a distance. But I want to read some of what his bandmates had to say in remembering him today. Ringo Starr tweeted, quote, "Tuesday, the 8th of December, 1980, we all had to say goodbye to John. Peace and love, John." And he also called on radio stations to play Strawberry Fields Forever, which Lennon wrote about his childhood. And Paul McCartney recently gave an interview to the New York Times Magazine where he said, quote, "After he was killed, he was taken to Frank Campbell's funeral parlor in New York. I'm often passing that. I never pass it without saying, 'All right, John. Hi, John.' Despite all the talk that Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono broke up the band, which is not true. Everyone will tell you that. There's still a lot of fondness over the years. And we've heard all kinds of legendary stories about how they broke up, when they broke up, fights, bandmates not talking to each other for years. But still, they remain very connected to him. What do you make of it?
It's an interesting story and one that we don't really know that much about. We know they broke up, and we think, because they traded insults in songs sometimes, that Lennon and McCartney didn't have regard for each other. But we've learned over time that they did have contact, that they did have a fond relationship well after the Beatles had broken up. That final album that John and Yoko released, Double Fantasy, this is a moment when John returned to making music, and he said in passing, partly inspired by the album that Paul McCartney released in 1980. He thought, that's pretty good. If he can keep going, so can I. And remember, Paul is still making new music, still putting on 3-hour shows live on stage for 3 hours in his 70s. Back then in 1980, we didn't know that. We didn't know how long these guys would keep going. We didn't know if the world would still be interested. We had no way of knowing at all. And so there's this remarkable sense that these guys who had given so much to each other gave something to each other right there at the end. John taking some inspiration from Paul in 1980 to continue making music, to return to making music. As he put it in a single, it was just like starting over.
Joe Levy, always a pleasure talking to you. Usually this is a Vlad sort of thing because, you and him you vibe on the whole music tip. But every time I talk to you, I learn something new and I'm inspired. So thanks for giving us the time.
Always great to see you.